It all began at 4 a.m. on September 20th, 1977. Rumors of strange lights, sometimes even craft, in the skies over the Soviet Union had persisted since World War II. With top-secret U.S. spy planes flying over the nation, though, there was little reason to believe the phenomenon was otherworldly. But what happened that morning in the city of Petrozavodsk would leave Soviet leadership with no doubts. Something unexplained had crossed nearly the entire airspace of the Soviet Union and had even been spotted by NATO countries in the West. No one is sure who was the first to spot the phenomenon, but a group of dock workers just starting the early shift were stunned when they saw a blinding light emerge in the horizon from the direction of Lake Onega in the northwest of Russia. A local first aid unit, numerous military personnel, on-duty militia members, seamen at the port, airport staff, and an amateur astronomer all bore witness to what happened next. At first, the few residents of Petrozavodsk who were up at this early hour feared the worst. A nuclear attack was occurring. This being the height of the Cold War, the threat of American nuclear weapons raining down on their heads was an ever-present one for the Soviets, much like the reverse was true for the Americans. The approaching light was almost too bright to look at directly, and as it neared the city, it seemed to reform itself to resemble a massive jellyfish in the sky. Any thoughts that this might be an incoming nuclear attack of some sort vanished when the light slowed to a hover and suddenly bathed the city below in beams of ultra-thin light, like lasers. The mysterious object continued to drift over the city for 10 to 12 minutes before transforming into a bright semicircle and jetting off to the northwest in the direction it had come. Witnesses described it leaving a faintly glowing red hole in the clouds that it punched through before disappearing, as if it had burned through the clouds themselves. As news of the event broke, the Soviet Union scrambled to respond to what might have just been the most significant intrusion of its airspace in history. Was this another damned American secret craft of some kind? Or could it be that something else entirely had just made its presence known to the citizens of Petrozavodsk? The director of the nearby Hydrometeorological Observatory noted that none of his personnel on duty had witnessed the event. However, there was no denying the flood of eyewitness reports coming from the city itself. Soon, though, reports came in of a similar phenomenon across the Soviet Union, and even reports that it had been spotted in Finland as well. Photos of the phenomenon were even reported to have been taken by the Finns, though no one knows what happened to the images. Only one of the images inside the Soviet Union was ever released, and its authenticity is unknown. A quiet panic set in amongst the political and military elite of the Soviet Union, as by now it was undeniable that something completely unexplained had crossed a significant chunk of their airspace and gone completely unnoticed by the Soviet Union's air defense networks. Local authorities in the affected regions wrote to the Presidium of the Academy of Science asking for an official explanation to quell their citizens' fears, but none was available. Letters from the public were growing in number by the day, and nations in Northern Europe were expressing concern over a possible new weapon test by the Soviet Union, which they naturally denied. Anatoly Alexandrov, under domestic and international pressure, wrote a letter to the Vice President and Chairman of the Military Industrial Commission requesting that a formal investigation be put together. This prompted the chairman to ask Dr. A. Shokin, chairman of the Scientific and Technical Council, to bring up the possibility of launching an official investigation at the next council meeting. The next month, at the council meeting, the contents of Alexandrov's letter was shared with the committee, and Lieutenant General B.A. Kiasov would state, quote, "The Academy of Sciences of the USSR can neither ignore nor explain the paranormal phenomenon similar to that observed in September 1977 in Petrozavodsk, and thus the AS asks to organize a thorough investigation of paranormal phenomenon with the involvement of organizations of the Ministry of Defense and MIC." Eyewitness statements from the military service members helped to legitimize the need for a formal investigation to the council, and ultimately the meeting concluded with a resolution recommending that funding be included in the 1978 state budget for a program titled Research of Paranormal Atmospheric and Space Phenomena. The STC also recommended that a group of experts be sent to Petrozavodsk to investigate the mysterious sighting. The recommendation was adopted and included in the next update to the current 5 years plan for defense research activities, setting out 2 investigations to begin work in 1978 and run without interruption until 1990. The one investigation would be conducted by the Ministry of Defense, specifically focusing on the effect of paranormal atmospheric and space phenomenon on the military and its equipment, and the second would be conducted by the Academy of Sciences and focused on understanding the nature of the phenomenon. The 2 Soviet investigations would collectively become known as the Network, but had 2 dramatically different goals that made cooperation difficult, if not impossible. The military arm of the investigation was only concerned with how UFOs affected the Soviets' ability to defend itself, and investigated them as a possible threat to the Union's conventional and nuclear capabilities. The civilian arm of the investigation, meanwhile, conducted more broad research into the phenomenon in an attempt to understand its true nature. Given that the military side of the house had access to far better sensors and witnesses, the civilian investigation was often frustrated, as the military investigation classified many reports and even evidence outside of the reach of the Academy of Sciences. The Soviet investigation was, as most things in the Soviet Union, carefully shepherded to project the correct political and cultural narrative. The term UFO, for instance, was banned, both because of its implication of extraterrestrial origin and because of its ties to America. Instead, UFOs were termed paranormal phenomenon. Further, rather than conducting an open and public investigation, the Soviet Union classified the research in order to avoid public alarm or the appearance of endorsing any of a number of publicly held theories about the phenomenon. The investigation thus had three stipulations. First, all investigative activities were automatically classified under the guise of defensive research. Second, until proven otherwise, all UFO phenomenon were assumed to be military activity and/or research and development. Third, in the event that an investigation of the phenomenon led to the discovery of previously unknown origins, such as an extraterrestrial one, then any discoveries or knowledge gathered was to first and immediately be used for military applications. The Soviet UFO investigation was thus as flawed from the start as the American Project Blue Book before it, if not even more so. While Project Blue Book kept many findings close to its chest, it at least engaged the public in its ongoing investigation, often relying on public hotlines to discover investigative leads as people reported UFO sightings and sometimes even outright crashes or landings. Project Blue Book also shared at least some data with the public, allowing for independent verification or critique. The Soviets would keep their investigation much more secretive, releasing only pre-approved conclusions about specific events from time to time. Often decreed as being overly classified, the network's investigations were hampered by the division of labor between the Academy of Sciences and the military, with the military refusing to share much of its data or conclusions with the civilian-led investigation. The preassumption that all UFO activity was military in nature also hamstrung the investigation. You don't conduct science by entering an investigation with a pre-conclusion of the origin of what you're investigating. Here, though, the Soviets were simply doing as the Americans had before them, as both sides had shared similar thinking. UFO activity could be exploited by a potential adversary as cover for their own technological breakthroughs. The third term of the investigation was unsurprising. Whatever the UFO phenomenon was, it had displayed truly incredible feats of physics and the ability to penetrate the Soviet air defense network and avoid interception. Any recovered technology or scientific discoveries were to be first used for military application. Thus, the two investigations set off on parallel but different paths. The military investigation took a keen interest in reported penetrations of airspace over military bases, port facilities, and most alarming of all, nuclear weapon or energy sites. It sought to investigate the psychological impact on servicemen who had witnessed it, and the malfunctions the phenomenon was reported to induce on military equipment. When possible, attempts were made to identify the exact cause and the degree of threat that it posed to Soviet military capabilities. The civilian investigation, meanwhile, relied on public reports and those gathered by the various arms of the Soviet scientific community. Both investigations, however, published very few public reports, given the classification of their research, which made it difficult for the civilian investigation to do its job. The military investigation was headquartered at one of the Central Military Research Institutes in Moscow. V. Balashov, an expert in the study of the effect of radiation and other phenomenons on military equipment, was put in charge of the investigation, which telegraphed that the Soviets were particularly concerned about reported effects on military equipment by UFOs. A small group of 4 to 5 military and civilian experts aided Balashov with his research, with the group being frequently swapped out year by year. Dr. V. Migulin, director of the Institute of Terrestrial Magnetism, Ionosphere, and Radio Wave Propagation of the Academy of Sciences, was assigned as chief of the civilian investigation. He was a radiophysicist and expert in the field of radio wave oscillation and propagation and radiolocation. Izmiran was designated as the head institute of the investigation, and a similar work group of 4 or 5 specialists were assigned to work under Migulin. Details remain scarce about the military investigation, even though it ended 33 years ago. The civilian investigation, however, was budgeted by participating organizations. It did not receive special government budgeting and thus was significantly hampered by a lack of funds. This shortage meant that specialized equipment to track and record or photograph UFOs could not be procured, and some investigations, such as into the development of large-scale plasma formations in the atmosphere, could not be carried out. As the least funded of all defense research projects, the civilian investigation was far more passive than active, collecting data and carrying out surveys long after the fact, with little ability to conduct proactive research or data collection. Nonetheless, the civilian arm collected a massive amount of data from eyewitnesses and even analyzed alleged physical encounters or landings. Unfortunately, given the project's limitations, only a small percentage of the total data could be thoroughly reviewed. Eventually, the project came to 3 conclusions about the phenomenon. Number 1, UFOs are the product of human activity. Number 2, UFOs are the product of natural processes taking place on Earth, in the atmosphere or in the near-space region. And number 3, UFOs are the result of activity from extraterrestrial civilizations. The Academy admitted that while the third conclusion was the most far-fetched and had the least supporting evidence, nonetheless the investigators felt it was impossible to remove it as a possibility. Much like U.S. efforts in Project Blue Book or Project Grudge, a not insignificant number of incidents just couldn't be explained with their current scientific understanding of the world. But even as some within the Soviet Union wished for the UFO phenomenon to die down, it did the exact opposite, with activity increasing exponentially as sensors improved and more witnesses felt more comfortable coming forward. Disturbingly for the Soviets, neighboring NATO countries were also often experiencing the exact same phenomenon, and similarities in reported phenomenon were appearing worldwide. A tall iron curtain still existed between East and West, but the Soviets were discovering that the same disk or cigar or orb-shaped objects were being reported globally. Given the rapidly advancing pace of U.S. air and space technology, the Soviet military had a markedly more enlightened approach to UFO reporting within the military than the U.S. did. While the U.S. heavily engaged in ridicule culture even within its own military, the Soviet Union enacted new guidelines that obligated its soldiers to report any strange or unexplained phenomenon that they experienced while on duty. Given that Soviet spy planes never flew over the U.S., though, it's easy to see why the two sides took such radically different approaches to their reporting on UFOs. In 1980, the Chief of General Staff of the USSR issued a directive that allowed the civilian UFO investigation access to eyewitness reports from military personnel. This effectively gave the Soviet civilian UFO investigation access to witnesses covering a staggering 1/6 of the Earth, a feat no other organization or nation could hope to achieve. However, the military investigation still retained much information under high levels of classification, and sharing of data gathered by various military sensor platforms remained out of reach of the civilian investigation. UFO reports within the Soviet military received 2 levels of priority. The first was of a sighting or experience that had no direct effects on the safety or normal function of the military unit in question. The second and much more serious priority, which received immediate attention, was when the phenomenon caused equipment malfunctions, failures, or harm to Soviet personnel or equipment. These reports were immediately sent to the program chiefs and completely bypassed all intermediary stages of reporting. Over the course of the investigation, over 3,000 pieces of data were gathered and analyzed that was considered extraordinary. However, that did not mean that they were necessarily otherworldly. Ultimately, the investigation would reveal that most nighttime sightings were the result of rocket launches or tests of aerospace equipment. The Petrozavodsk incident was ultimately explained as the launch of the Cosmos 955 satellite from the Cosmodrome in Plesetsk. However, some would take issue with that explanation, which failed to account for the widely witnessed beams of light that the object in question shot down to the ground, as well as the object's ability to hover slowly and change directions. Other similarly incredible UFO sightings, however, could easily be explained by rocket launches. On June 14, 1980, a massive dolphin-shaped object was described by witnesses all over European Russia. This was discovered to be the launch of the Cosmos 1188 satellite and was witnessed all the way in South America. The result of the next most widely reported UFO turned out to be balloons, which were widely used around the world to study atmospheric phenomenon and could drift for miles. Normally, though, these balloons don't drift too far from their launch locations, and thus most eyewitnesses would not be overly surprised by one. However, as the investigation showed, sometimes balloons can do surprising things, completely confounding witnesses. One such incident was a UFO reported by a Soviet fighter squadron on patrol over the border with China. A pilot had detected a spherical object at an altitude of 50,000 feet and moved to engage it when it suddenly disappeared. An investigation discovered a local meteorological station had launched the balloon at the exact time of the UFO encounter. This balloon's shell had been unexpectedly tough, accounting for it climbing much higher than expected. At some point, it is possible the balloon had simply burst, fooling the pilot into believing that the craft he was witnessing had disappeared. 3 months later, fighter pilots over the Chukotka Peninsula had a similar encounter, with the object once more disappearing. A nearby meteorological station was discovered to have launched a balloon of their own at the same time, though lost telemetry data from it in a malfunction. It was believed that the two balloons could have come from the same manufacturing batch and thus shared a defect that made their skin tougher than expected, allowing them to rise higher than intended. Balloons and rockets were found to explain 90% of UFO reports inside the Soviet Union, prompting skeptics to disregard the possibility of an unidentified aerial phenomenon entirely. Yet a significant number of cases avoided explanation, and as the Academy of Sciences itself pointed out, some of these had a significant number of witnesses. Other cases that defied explanation included alleged landings or crashes of physical craft. One such incident that defied explanation occurred on Hill 611 near the village of Delnigorsk. Here, a multitude of witnesses observed a flying reddish sphere crash into the hill with a very violent impact. The Academy of Sciences sent a field team to investigate and discovered physical evidence along with burned terrain, verifying that something had indeed crashed there with great force. The investigators discovered fine metal mesh, small spherical residue objects, and pieces of what appeared to be glass. The composition of the debris was similarly baffling, including gold, silver, nickel, alpha titanium, molybdenum, and beryllium compounds. Skeptical physicists concluded that the ball had been some form of plasmoid, which had captured the metallic elements in the upper atmosphere before descending to Earth. However, this explanation was rejected on the grounds that for this to explain the discovered debris, the elements involved would have had to exceed current levels by a factor of 4,000. Doctor of Chemical Sciences V. Vysotsky stated, quote, "Without doubt, this is evidence of a high technology, and it's not anything of a natural or terrestrial origin." Dr. Vysotsky pointed to the discovery that the fine mesh included bits of metallic threads with a diameter of only 17 microns, and these threads were themselves made up of even thinner strands twisted into tight braids. Extremely thin gold wires were intertwined amongst the smallest of the threads, a feat well outside the possibility of human manufacturing at the time. However, physicist Yuri Platov of the Terrestrial Magnetism Institute disagreed. He stated that the material was nothing more than debris from a failed rocket launch. Whether said rocket launch took place at the same time as the sighting unfortunately remains unknown, as the Soviet Union often kept its launches a secret and did not release information on their dates or successes. Sightings of landings by trained professionals also troubled the skeptical conclusion to the project's data. In 1989, an engineer along with a group of workers at a collective farm witnessed a disc-like craft land and emit 2 beams of light from the sides. The craft remained on the ground for 20 minutes before flying away noiselessly. This UFO, like many other alleged landings, had left behind a depression in the vegetation where it landed. This phenomenon was also widely reported not just in the USSR but beyond it, and no explanation has ever been offered. As often, this vegetation is shown to be either burned or wilted or dies soon after the alleged landing occurs. In the USSR, Anatoly Listratov, chairman of the All-Union Astronomical and Geodesic Society, stated, quote, "At the sites of the landings, the operating frequency of a crystal controller oscillator changes. Simply speaking, electronic timepieces run at rates that are either too fast or too slow." End quote. Reports similar to the Petrozavodsk incident were also coming in from the military. Listratov had received reports from military aviators of a UFO sighted over the city of Borisov. The crews of 2 aircraft spotted a large flying disc with 5 beams of light emanating from within it. 3 beams were aimed at the ground below, and when the planes first came across it, 2 beams were aimed upward to the sky. Ground control instructed one of the planes to change course and approach the object, with the disc immediately flying level to the approaching aircraft and firing one of the light beams at it. The beam blinded the men inside the cockpit and both felt heat as it passed over them. Both crew members became sick immediately after the incident, with the co-pilot being forced to leave military service due to a serious decline in his health, which included prolonged periods of unconsciousness. The aircraft commander died months after the encounter, with the cause of death being listed as cancer. Some sightings became impossible to deny or explain. Chief amongst these was a sighting of a massive UFO near the city of Omsk, with hundreds of witnesses flooding local newspapers to report the incident. One report filed by a Major V. Longinoff stated that the object was not visible to radar and appeared as a visible shining sphere 1.5 times as large as the moon. The object cast very bright beams of light around itself and hovered over the airport for about 5 minutes before slightly descending. The object then appeared to turn off its light beams and accelerate at great speed toward the northwest. Pilots at a neighboring airport reported seeing the object visually but couldn't detect it on radar, and military personnel at Altay-Cray reported within 5 minutes of the craft disappearing from over Omsk, stating that they too could now see the object. The major concluded that to travel from Omsk to Altay-Cray, the object had to be traveling at around 7,000 kilometers an hour. The Soviet investigation into UFOs ended in 1990 as the nation was facing its own impending collapse. However, a separate effort continued in the new Russian Federation until at least 1998. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, though, researchers on both sides of the old Iron Curtain were at last able to share notes, and Western observers were stunned to discover that the exact same incidents at nuclear weapon sites and other military installations perfectly mirrored what had been reported in the US and by its allies. It's currently unknown if the Russian Federation continues to pursue research into UFOs, but with the US having been discovered to be continuously researching the phenomenon for decades without acknowledging it after its own official investigation was shut down, it is likely that the old Soviet project to understand the phenomenon is alive and well today. Now go learn about the secret UFO crash recovery program. With intelligence official reveals US is recovering crashed alien UFOs. Or click this other video instead.